The prisoner shaved off his beard, gave himself a stylish haircut. Then he put on a stolen police uniform with a confident stride. He walked right out of the prison. His drastically different appearance from his bearded self made it impossible for anyone to recognize him. All he had to do was walk through that door, and he'd be free. Just then, a guard stepped in front of the door, but instead of stopping him, the guard mistook him for a new officer, greeted him with a nod, and even held the door open for him. And just like that, Neal walked right out of prison. Once outside, he spotted a small truck, hot-wired it effortlessly, and played his favorite song on a cassette tape as he drove away. At the entrance of an airport parking lot, he stopped by a second-hand store and bought a used valet uniform for $3. Sure enough, as soon as he arrived at the airport, the owner of a luxury car mistook him for a valet, handed him the keys along with a crisp $100 bill. Just like that, Neal transformed from a fugitive into a man driving a luxury car. The man's name was Neal. He was a notorious art thief, sentenced to 4 years in prison for theft and financial crimes. But with just 4 weeks left until his release, he chose to escape. Meanwhile, the FBI agent who had put Neal behind bars, Peter Burke, was struggling with another case, a criminal organization known as the Dutchmen. Peter had spent 3 years tracking them, only to be outplayed time and again. This time, all he had to show for his efforts was a strange metal thread left behind at the crime scene. When Peter got the news that Neal had escaped, he immediately rushed to the prison as expected. He found an anomaly in the visitor logs. Neal's girlfriend had visited him every week without fail, but for the past 2 weeks, she hadn't shown up. Peter pulled up surveillance footage of her past visits and quickly realized that Neal's escape was likely tied to her. Without wasting time, he headed straight for her apartment. And there he found Neal sitting on the floor, completely devastated. His girlfriend was gone. Neal was so lost in despair that he wasn't even thinking about running anymore. He was ready to turn himself in. That was when he noticed the metallic thread on Peter's jacket. It was a clue left behind by the Dutchman. Neal instantly recognized it. "I can help you," he told Peter, "but on one condition: you have to visit me in prison next week." Peter knew just how valuable Neal's insight could be. A simple visit, that was an easy deal to make. Neal then revealed that the metal thread was actually the security strip embedded in Canada's latest $100 bills. Peter had his team verify it immediately, and sure enough, Neal was right. With this breakthrough, Peter returned to the prison to see what else Neal knew. But this time, Neal had a new demand. He wanted to be released on parole and work as a special consultant for the FBI. After careful consideration, Peter agreed. Neal was out again, though this time with an electronic anklet tracking his every move. If he failed to help the FBI catch the Dutchman, he'd be sent straight back to prison. But Neal knew this was his best shot at freedom. Peter wasn't about to make things easy for Neal. Instead of a comfortable home, he arranged for him to stay at a rundown halfway house. But Peter had underestimated Neal's charm. At the halfway house, Neal met a wealthy woman who was there to donate clothes. Using his signature charisma and good looks, he quickly won her over. The next day, when Peter arrived to check on Neal, he found that he had moved out. To his shock, Neal was now living in a luxurious mansion in the heart of the city. Neal, reading the morning paper, casually explained, "I'm not freeloading. I'm babysitting her granddaughter." Peter scoffed, thinking he'd caught Neal in a lie until the woman's granddaughter walked in. Peter couldn't hide his jealousy. Neal smirked as Peter sat down and stole a bite of his breakfast. But Peter wasn't about to let him enjoy it too much. He immediately told the woman that Neal was a convicted criminal. Unfazed, she simply replied, "So was my late husband." Peter was speechless. He had no choice but to drag Neal to work. The FBI's latest lead on the Dutchman case was a batch of fairy tale books. At first glance, the books seemed completely ordinary, but for some reason, the Dutchman's crew had been repeatedly purchasing the same books from overseas. Peter interrogated the book dealer responsible for the shipments, but the man insisted he was just a regular businessman. Then, suddenly, a man who claimed to be a lawyer walked in, stating that their interrogation was not in accordance with procedure and ordered Peter to leave. Peter assumed the book dealer had called for legal representation. Frustrated, he left the room, but his assistant soon pointed out something strange. There hadn't been enough time for the dealer to call a lawyer. Peter's gut told him something was wrong. He rushed back into the interrogation room, but it was too late. The book dealer was already dead. Peter was furious, but at least one thing was clear: the books were the key to cracking the case. Upon closer examination, they discovered that all the books were printed by the same publisher in 1944. Each contained a unique type of parchment paper, one that was no longer in production. That's when they realized the Dutchman was planning to use this rare paper to counterfeit something. Tracing the book dealer's last movements, they discovered that he had recently visited a museum, his purpose photographing a rare World War II-era American bond that had once been stolen and never redeemed. Neal compared the parchment paper to the museum bond. A perfect match. Could they be planning to counterfeit these bonds? Sure enough, Neal said the bond was fake because it still smelled of ink. It had been printed recently. If the criminal gang swapped out the museum's original forgeries, then the fake ones they had printed would pass as real. That's when it hit them. The Dutchman's crew was forging these historical bonds. They had already acquired 600 books. Each sheet of parchment was worth $350,000. If they succeeded, they could cash in a total of $150 million. Now that the FBI knew their plan, all that remained was to capture them. The problem: they still had no leads on their identities. But Neal knew forgers often left subtle signatures in their work. After hours of meticulous study, he finally found it. The initial CH, Neal recognized the name immediately. Curtis Hagen, a renowned art restoration expert. Peter's team tracked Hagen to a warehouse in an industrial district. But without a warrant, they couldn't just barge in. Neal, however, had a plan. The next day, Neal showed up at the warehouse with a camera and started taking pictures. As expected, security quickly grabbed him and dragged him inside. That's when Neal saw its stacks of counterfeit bonds being printed in real time. Security locked Neal in an office while they figured out what to do with him. But Neal calmly locked the office door from the inside. Panicked, the guards shouted threats, waving their guns. That's when the alarm went off. The police had arrived. Peter, having received a report that Neal had escaped, had rushed over. But upon arriving at the warehouse, he realized exactly what Neal was up to. Using the pretense of chasing a fugitive, Peter secured the legal authority to search the premises. Everything they needed was right in front of them. After years of toying with the FBI, the Dutchman's crew was finally arrested. With the case closed, Peter finally started to respect Neal's skills. Neal, in turn, had fulfilled his end of the bargain. Now he only had to work for the FBI for 4 years to earn his freedom. But just when it seemed like things were looking up, Neal received a photo. It was of his girlfriend. She had been kidnapped, so her disappearance hadn't been voluntary after all.